I'm Alexi Mackinnon, and Lynn Rogers and I are, this is our 6th of a 11-week series that we're doing about key time periods in the world. And Lynn Rogers would like to give you a little more information about it.
Why don't we first just share our name and astrology signs, in case people aren't acquainted with each other. I'm Lynn, a Virgo.
I'm Alexi Mackinnon.
I'm Lisa, an Aries.
I'm Arlene, a Sagittarian.
I'm Bea, Gemini.
Walter Scorpio.
John, Libra.
Mary, a Pisces.
Don, Leo. Joe, Pisces.
And Alexi, Aries.
Tonight we're going to talk about Edgar Cayce's view of the biblical periods, the Old Testament, some key lifetimes in the Old Testament period, as well as some insights into Palestine itself. The Cayce topic for tonight is setting and discovering your own spiritual identity. So what I suggest that you do, as you're listening to this, what I would like you to do, just allow the creative part of your own brain or creative consciousness to germinate on what for you might be a spiritual ideal, a word or a phrase that would sum up what it is that you're striving for. Just as each of these people that we're going to look at tonight had a spiritual ideal which they either, as Cayce said, they gained, they tried to attain it, or they lost, they fell away from it. So you too have an unconscious spiritual ideal. And Cayce said that if you put it into word form or write it down, that it helps you. It's kind of a lodestar or a shining light that helps you on your path in life. And later on, when you write down your regression or your guided healing session, perhaps you can make a note of that spiritual ideal. It always seems like a lot to cover, but here we go. To begin with the Old Testament, let's look back again at the Atlantean concept of the Creator. In Jessica Madigan's, one of her 3 volumes, The Past Lives of Jesus and Mary, Volume 1, and much, honestly, of the information that I'm sharing with you is drawn from those 3 manuscripts, which are now not in print or available, as well as Cayce teachings and some further of my own insights. She says in her volume, The Past Lives of Jesus and Mary, Volume 1, the one God of the Atlanteans, as taught by Emilius and Amelia, was the eternal masculine-feminine principle. Emilius, who was androgynous, and remember we talked about how we as spiritual beings may have been male, female, and one light beings who came into the earth's realm before Lemuria. And that Jesus and Mary, too, are sort of a pattern for experiences that we may be able to identify with. They were twin souls, they had brother-sister souls, and they were in one androgynous energy in the beginning of time. And it was possibly through them, that being, the special leadership of that being, that others followed suit and did some of the early creating and miscreating with the mind force that drew us into enmeshment or embodiment, where we had to start a series of lifetimes. We had to become physical in order to journey back toward the God source, as defined by the Atlanteans. And we're going to talk tonight, there's quite a heavy theme, because of it is Old Testament and New Testament material. The lifetime of the entity that later became Jesus is accented. And I'd like to share with you what Edgar Cayce said about Jesus and the Christ, Jesus the Christ. He said, as to the physical consciousness and the Christ consciousness, Edgar Cayce gives, Christ is not a man. Jesus in one incarnation, Joshua in another, Melchizedek in another. Jesus was the man, Christ the messenger. Christ in all ages, Jesus in one. In another reading, Edgar Cayce gave that there had never been a time in the history of the earth where there not had been a Christ and a Christ Mass. So, Edgar Cayce was educated as a Presbyterian Sunday school superintendent, and he only read the Bible every year of his life. And in some of his readings, he seems to reflect more closely his Presbyterian background, but in many, many readings, if you look at the depth of the readings, he seems to be saying this, that the Christ is something potentially within us. It is that ageless spirit that we're seeking to actualize, and that Jesus somehow played a unique role. And I don't know whether is Jesus the only one who's ever manifested this. I don't know. It seems in our recorded history that this is so. So he says, Jesus was the man, Christ the messenger. Christ in all ages, Jesus in one. And Jessica writes, the story of Amelia Amelius, who became Mary and Jesus, is the story of our journey throughout the earth. They have taken the road ahead of us. They have pointed out the rough places which we may trod. They have brought the eternal principles into manifestation. Edgar Cayce makes it very clear in many readings that the former incarnations of Jesus were lived as a human being, with the strengths and weaknesses of a human being. It was Jesus who became the Christ. Again, at some time, perhaps millenniums hence, she says, each Adam, each Eve, perhaps attaining to their own Christ consciousness, may journey away from this system into other planetary systems, and the sorrows of earth will be long forgotten. So we're going to review some of the past lifetimes of Jesus and Mary and other key teacher souls, with an emphasis on completing a chronological understanding of their activities during what we term the Old Testament period and in Palestine. And so far, to try to review what we've touched on so far, we touched on that earliest androgynous being, the beautiful one, coming from the celestial realms. And then in Lemuria, something that was called the Lord or Lady of the Dark Face. This is when they were in the process of the fall. And then this soul would have been kind of like viewed as a large, overshadowing dark face over Lemuria. Then as Amelius, which was a 2-in-1, Amelius, Amelia, in early Atlantis, and then finally in the earliest Garden of Eden, splitting into Adam and Eve, then Rama and Sita in early India, then the first Krishna, and the twin soul being someone who stayed out of the body when the Jesus soul was Krishna. And then as Hermes the Nubian with his mother Mara, the Black Madonna, who died when he was quite young. And later when Hermes the Nubian was found by Rata, high priest of Egypt, when he traveled into Egypt when he was exiled. It's interesting to remember that Rata was trying to bring in the concept of one husband, one wife, but he was very human, and he was tempted into getting together for an affair with a dancer, and so out of that, then he was exiled out of the country, kind of like we talked about that being the Jim and Tammy Baker of Egypt concept. But in any case, even some of the mistakes we make can end up being to the greater good, because he made personal mistakes, but on the other hand, he had the opportunity to meet Hermes, who was the same soul, this time in a black body. His mother was also black, because all the races are equal. We talked about that in the sexes. They're just expressions of us. So he had his mother, the Black Madonna, died when he was a little boy, and when he came back into Egypt with Rata, he met later a young wife named Seshat, who probably was his mother returned, reincarnated, much later on. They lived a long, long time in those days. The next, now, and that's in a consecutive order, the ones I just covered. So the next consecutive key lifetimes would be those of Enoch and his twin soul, Anna or Hannah. Are any of you familiar with Enoch? There's the recent keys of Enoch, and I don't even know how this connects, but undoubtedly it does in some way. Enoch was the writer of one of the very, very early books of the Bible, and this is implied that this is also a past life of Jesus, is Enoch. And it was the book most used by the Essenes, who are one of the, we'll get into that on Palestine, they were one of the Jewish sects that was the most mystical. And they're the ones that prepared for the coming of Jesus. And so Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed the work of Enoch. He was a comforter of his people. He was one who lived in dreams and visions, one who was taken up onto other worlds, one who foresaw the future and knew of the coming of Jesus. The book of Enoch was later put aside by the early church fathers because it contained so much of a mystical kind of orientation. Enoch's life, he was given to things, he was affluent, he had a lot of nice things, was happily married to his twin soul, who may have become, later Mary, the Blessed Mother, and she at this time was called Anna or Hannah. His children grew up about him, and one of his sons was the long-lived Methuselah of the Bible. But he too felt like a stranger in the earth. He was seeking out the meaning of life, and he wanted to know more about the future as well as the past. Because of his desire to understand the mysteries of the universe, he had a vision that he was taken to other realms, which is very similar to the new Book of Enoch that's being circulated, that he had a vision where angelic beings took him out of the body into other realms, and he was told that he would live long enough to be able to write down his dreams and visions, and then he would be translated, meaning he wouldn't really die physically, but then he would have an experience sort of like Jesus where he would transcend in some way. Only even, in this case, the body didn't die. More like in Atlantis, where they were fourth dimensional and they could kind of just walk in and out of the body at will. And he, Cayce said, this is about Enoch, he was made manifest in birth through the union of channels, that's his parents, growing out of that thought of the Creator made manifest, and that would be their ideal that they were carrying, but so expressed, so manifested as Enoch as to merit the escaping of death. Because very frequently, Edgar Cayce said that the attitudes that a parents hold around the conception and coming in of a child will affect the later outcome of that child's life. And in this case, his parents had such a strong ideal, spiritual ideal in mind that it actually allowed him later to merit the escaping of death. And when we think about Jesus and his life, we have to also think about what was Mary's spiritual ideal while she went through this experience of this conception and this carrying of this child, because it also had fruit in the consciousness that he was able to attain. And the writings of some of Enoch's writings parallel those of Hermes the Nubian, who preceded him, and also Khans, the early Egyptian, who followed him, using a lot of sun and moon imagery. These are all past lives, supposedly, of Jesus. Not only do the writings of Enoch foretell the last lifetime he would live as Jesus, who would become the Christ, but Enoch also beholds the Christ consciousness throughout the earth. Enoch was then a way-shower, too. He was a prophet of the Christ, which he would one day become. And I wanted to share with you some excerpts from his writing and prophecies, which closely parallel those of Jesus and of John the Beloved, who was expressing some of the teachings of Jesus. What is striking, if you ever have an opportunity to read these, when you start to hear almost the same words being said by all of these individuals, it certainly makes a case that this indeed could be true. Enoch said, "In a voice was heard from heaven, the elect shall possess light, joy, and peace. They shall inherit the earth." And Jesus said, "And lo, a voice from heaven saying, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Enoch said, In the days of sinners the years shall be shortened, and everything on earth shall be subverted and disappear in its season. And Jesus said, There shall be famines and earthquakes, or maybe this is John the Beloved, in diverse places, for there then shall great tribulation such as was not since the beginning of time. Enoch said, The former heaven shall depart and pass away, a new heaven shall appear. And Jesus said, John the Beloved said, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Enoch, in that place I beheld a fountain of righteousness which never failed, encircled by many springs of wisdom. Of these all the thirsty drank, and were filled with wisdom. And John said, But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him, he's speaking of the words of Jesus, shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water sprung up into everlasting life. You hear a parallel there? I really did. Because whatever our work is and throughout the earth, we kind of continue and build on our own past life patterns. And that's what we have an opportunity to see in some of these regressions. We get insights into what we have experienced before that we're building on today. It's almost uncanny reading all this. It gives you a much clearer understanding that there really is no death. I mean, that we really continue in our energy and our purpose. And nothing happens by chance. There really are very few accidents. We're picking up things that we've done before. We're picking up on our weaknesses and on our strengths too. So Jessica writes, long before the discovery of the Gnostic literature or the Dead Sea Scrolls, Edgar Cayce had given the past lives of Jesus, Enoch, Jeshua, Asaph, etc. And a lot of scholars, when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scholars began to challenge the authenticity of Jesus because they were finding the same words in these previous personalities. So they said, then this must be a composite, or did Jesus really talk? Did he really exist? And in a sense, though, it's very strong confirmation of reincarnation, because they were struck by the fact that the same thing has been said by these other characters who, Edgar Cayce separately, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were uncovered, said were the past lives of Jesus. So it's a pretty strong case. The next period we're going to look at is that of Melchizedek. This was given by Edgar Cayce as a former incarnation of Jesus. There are very few references to him in the Bible, but they're very pregnant with meaning. He was supposed to be without father or mother. Now this would be kind of a continuation of what Enoch was able to do, where he didn't really die, he sort of just left. And so in the same way, this time Melchizedek came back the same way Enoch had left. And his twin soul was probably either out of the body, overshadowing him, or possibly almost sharing an embodiment with him, as in the Atlantean time, maybe. That occurs to me. I don't know. But very close in an other dimensionary type of a way. So he established a spiritual school of learning which dealt with the inner mysteries. And this may or may not have been a physical temple. But in Psalms 110:4 it says, "The Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And it's interesting that when Jessica, my teacher, was working as a secretary to the Jesuits, and many of the strange and unusual things she did over her lifetime, she was doing a lot of typing related to the Catholic Bible, some of the concordance and so forth, and she discovered that they interpret this psalm as referring to Christ. So the Catholics support what Edgar Cayce said. St. Paul writes it, and St. Paul later in the New Testament wrote about Jesus and called him of God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Same thing. And it's certainly doubtful that Edgar Cayce, who was such a quite orthodox in his conscious life as this Presbyterian Sunday school teacher, and who only read the King James Version of the Bible, would not have had access to the fact that the Catholics link this somehow to the Christ teaching.
One of the things about that, could I
Please, yeah.
was that Melchizedek prefigured, as they use the term, the Christ figure of the New Testament, because one of the battles where the Jews were successful and they came back and they were greeted by the priest class and welcomed back, a sacrifice of thanksgiving was given, which included bread and wine, and that was a departure from the usual sacrifice that was made. So he was considered prefigurement of the Christ in the New Testament because of the unusual substances that were used as opposed
Thank
to
you.
usual.
You, having studied as a nun in this lifetime, would have areas of great knowledge that we're only touching upon, but that's certainly good confirmation of what she had shared. Yeah,
Well,
thank you
in
for
the
sharing
Keys
that.
of Enoch, there were 3 orders: Metatron,
Mm-hmm.
Enoch, and Melchizedek.
Oh, interesting.
So they were all parallel from the Godhead.
Interesting. So this ties into the recent
Yes.
teachings called the Keys of Enoch, which may tie to the ancient teachings in a way. I'm not sure how, but it's nothing new under the sun we're discovering. So when, it's interesting reading these books because it's really a kind of a journey through the life of this teacher that I so beloved to me, Jessica Madigan. And when she, due to a karmic circumstance from a past life, was sort of ousted or pushed out of this work that she cared so much about because of some superficial politics at that time, and also because the man who was left in charge of the Cayce work was her twin soul, and he was married and did not know what to do about the fact that they were twin souls. So all in all, she was pushed due to his uncomfortableness and others' jealousy out of something that she loved with her whole heart and was very gifted in sharing. And so she felt, this happened, she had been in her 30s, as if she had been separated even from God, because she equated the two together. And one night, she says, she fell into a deep sleep and began to dream one of the most vivid dreams of her lifetime. In a great hall, great temple, she went through corridor after corridor, finally coming to an enclosed room. She opened the door and saw a huge book with one phrase, this phrase written over and over in letters of gold: "Thou art of the order of Melchizedek forever." What did this mean, she wondered, knowing this was a past lifetime of Jesus? But what did it mean to her in her present life in this time of stress she was experiencing? And almost as if she was still in the dream, a deep feeling of silence came over her, and she suddenly knew that God's work, so to speak, had no particular boundary, that no institution could contain it, that it's of the heart, and that if she has a purpose that had gone with her through various lifetimes, it could not be taken from her by any outside person. And it was, that vow, by the way, was similar to one taken in the Temple Beautiful in Egypt, where the same soul who was now Melchizedek would have been Hermes, and that vow was that whether in a high place or whether in a low place, we would, for each lifetime, serve the living God. And so her dream was an answer that this was part of her mission. And and that she was to attempt to follow in the pattern of Jesus, who to her, she saw Jesus as one in all his lifetimes, trying to comfort those who sorrow apart, and that's the way she experienced him. And it's also thought that Melchizedek wrote the story of Job in the Bible. He wrote some of the earliest biblical books, and that was an exquisite dramatic poem, which of course is about the pious and upright chieftain who suffers a complete reversal of his fortunes. He has boils, he loses his property, his children, and it's really a hidden version of a philosophical discourse as to why do human beings suffer so much in their sojourns in the earth. And it was Job's great faith, despite his moments of deep despair and questioning, which eventually bring him healing and blessings again. So the next period that we would look at would be that of Joseph the dreamer, with the coat of many colors, and his twin soul Asenath, the Egyptian princess who was the daughter of high priest in Egypt, whom he was able to marry later on in his lifetime as Joseph. Edgar Cayce indicated, I guess, that those people who had known Jesus, this could be true of perhaps Mary or the others, many of his incarnations would be quickened in spirit by reading or hearing of the lifetime in which they had known him. And Jessica had an experience after she had a car accident. She was always very sensitive to animals, almost to a fault. It used to drive me nuts because she had so many homeless dogs that she would rescue from the laboratories, and she would pick up the stray injured animal on the freeway, and they would be chewing on her wonderful books. So the publishers who wanted them couldn't get them because they'd be being eaten. And so it was very frustrating to me. But in any case, she had a car accident while swerving to avoid a dog that had been hurt on the freeway. And after this accident, she went to a Cayce study group or something with her leg swollen, her ankle swollen in pain. And it was really very painful. And as a man was reading the story of Joseph from the Bible, and as this happened, she said she had an experience that must be lifted memory. And she was, when she returned from the experience, she was completely healed. And then and it related to the time of Joseph. Over the following winter, she would dream over and over about that time period until Joseph, or Yosef as she experienced him, became a living individual to her. So she must have been very closely associated with him then. And Joseph was born, as you know, into Egypt as Hebrew, where it became his karma to lead these people out of the land of Egypt. Yes. Okay, and she asked what were the deeper karmic patterns of this period. Jacob and Rachel, his parents, were twin souls, apparently very close. However, Jacob waited 7 years to marry Rachel, and remember in the biblical story, her father, he wanted to marry the oldest daughter first, so her father substituted her sister Leah on the wedding night. And Leah had been, remember we talked about an earlier lifetime of Sarah and Abraham, who had sent, Sarah had her handmaiden Hagar have a child because she couldn't conceive a child, and then much later she finally had her own child. And out of sort of a selfishness, extreme selfishness, she sent Hagar and her son, Hagar's son, into the desert so that her own son could become the leader of his people. And so karmically, Sarah came back as Rachel, happily married to Jacob, and but instead of getting to marry him, her twin soul, her father substituted her older sister Leah, who was Hagar, the one that she sent off into the desert naturally, because karma has a very long reach. And Jacob, her husband, was far from perfect either, but he indubitably did love Rachel. And again, a similar pattern repeating as our patterns can. After many years of childlessness, Rachel again offered Jacob her maidservant as his concubine. And this time, Leah, who'd been a maidservant before, she did the same thing. And the maidservants named Bilpah and Zilpah bore Jacob's sons. And after Leah, Bilpah, and Zilpah had borne Jacob 10 sons. I wonder, all these people with sons, where were their daughters? It wasn't a time of very fair treatment, but I suspect. What did you say?
The side of walls oftentimes.
Yes.
Really? That they killed the. Oh, how horrible! It was a time of real oppression of women, and in other talks we've talked about how there is much that's good about this period, but it was a very painful time for women, in which some of the early legends of religion, in which in ancient times the Creator even at times is viewed as the loving mother or the mother of all things, all of those legends were rewritten in new ways. And the creation story that Cayce said we split in half, instead Eve became a rib, which actually is the ancient Hebrew word for the other side of a person. But woman's status was dramatically decreased, and things associated with her mystical teachings in the past, like the serpent, which meant the wisdom of the Kundalini, or the apple, which was associated with the communal temples that these priestesses ran, became the symbol of evil, because they were trying to shift. There was infighting, and these new Hebrew religions had a more patriarchal descent of the name and the money and stuff, and so they were really imposing, extinguishing everything that women had known. And I'm sure there were exceptions, but it was a very oppressive time that we're looking at for women in many respects. And I'm sure if you had 10 sons, you probably had a good smattering of daughters. That's an awful lot of children to turn out, you know. So, so after, anyway, at least 10 sons, we know of them only, Rachel, whose tears had scarcely ceased because she hadn't given birth to a son, because Jessica said of childlessness and childishness also, finally she had a son, and she determined that she would outdo all other mothers. He would be the first to his father, and so he was the 11th of what became Jacob's 12 sons eventually. Now think of, in the Old Testament, Jesus and the 12 disciples too, the parallel. So she really wanted to outshine herself, and apparently the father too, and yet here they had attracted this very special and gifted soul who'd been Hermes and Melchizedek, and who later went on to becoming Jesus. But in this lifetime, we can see how a soul is, due to this, he came in with his parents instilling him kind of an overpride. He had been Ram, the Atlantean in Atlantis, who had done vast amounts of conquering when he went into India. And he was very prideful when his twin soul and wife Sita was taken off by a robber marauder. He was so sure that she had gotten pregnant by him that he rejected her for years and years when they could have been happy. And in fact, the child was his own. So the bottom line with this is that this soul, Joseph, is coming in already with a pattern of pride being one of his weaknesses. And then he has parents who love him to death and overindulge him and are convinced that he's going to be it. And when he told his brothers his dream, see if I can find that dream, they were understandably a little bit jealous, which led to some of the later problems that he suffered. He told his brother, so he had this dream. Oh, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed, Joseph said. We were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf. And so his brother said to him, shalt thou indeed reign over us, or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams. And so he had another dream. He told his brothers, I've had a dream. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And Joseph told it to his father, and Jacob rebuked Joseph and said, what is this dream thou hast dreamed? Shall I and your mother and thy brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee, to the earth? So there's a little ego here, a small amount, which then set his brothers up for feeling very competitive with him. And of course he felt somewhat inferior being so much younger, because the oldest males, not only did males dominate females, but the oldest males dominated the younger males. So he already had his own superiority-inferiority complex going at this point. And so when his mother Rachel when he was almost a man, she lost her life in childbirth, giving birth to his only full brother, Benjamin. And of course this would be part of the karma, I'm sure, for what she had done to Hagar and like this before. And according to Edgar Cayce, when you know the story of the brothers, they finally had enough of him and they're jealous, and so they're out with him one day in the desert, and they come back and tell the father they were going to cast him into a pit and kill him, I guess, and they come back and tell their father ultimately that they dip his robe in animal's blood and say that he was torn by animals. But there was one brother named Judah, who was the brother that insisted that rather than killing Joseph or casting him into a pit, that he should be sold for 20 pieces of silver. And Edgar Cayce says that soul came back as Judas at the time of Palestine. And he was the one who actually, according to Cayce, his intention was, he thought that if he his action of betraying Jesus was really to provoke Jesus into standing up for himself, and then Jesus would be the king instead of, this too passive a guy. So, and in fact, Edgar Cayce gave a reading for Judas today, and he wasn't altogether a bad person. I mean, he had a life, he had fairly many material things. The only problem is no one trusts him. That was his karma, just no one trusts him at all. So, I mean, it's almost universal. He was having this problem of being doubted at everything he did. Okay, so and it's here's a real interesting karmic twist. So I get this right. Sarah had sent her husband's son Ishmael into the desert with his mother when her own son was born, and it's interesting that it was the Ishmaelites that came along to whom they sold Joseph. So that's an interesting parallel. So it would be her karma. The very people she had sent someone else to were the people that took her own son that she thought was the greatest thing that ever had come about. And in Egypt, as you've read in the Bible, he was made a slave. He was refused his master's wife's advances. He was cast into prison, therefore. He was sent for by the Pharaoh, finally, when he was heard that he could interpret prophetic dreams. And then through that dream, he accurately predicted 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. He also became a statesman, second only to the Pharaoh. And it's interesting that this Pharaoh, who immediately picked up on this, this Hebrew prisoner and made him virtually Pharaoh, second only to himself, was the same Pharaoh who had been Rata in Egypt. And when Rata was sent out of Egypt for his Jim Baker stuff, he ran into Hermes the black man, who helped him immensely. So here comes this young guy who can interpret dreams just like Hermes did, who is Hermes. And so he immediately, unconsciously appreciated him and knew instinctively that this was the right person, and so he entrusted him with a great deal. And indeed, the prophecy that Joseph, through his dream, had been made, he became very elevated in Egypt. And so, because Hermes had stood by Rata when he was disgraced, it's like if Jim Baker had somebody now who's standing by him and later gets back in PTL, he's going to remember that and want to return the favor. It was the same kind of thing, only on a soul level. So, the historians do not still understand why Zoser, the Pharaoh, would relinquish the reins to Joseph, who later became called Imhotep. And Breasted, who's a historian, says that Joseph became, or Imhotep, was the most astute executive who ever ruled Egypt, and his policies persisted for 20 centuries. Later on, the later period that we've already studied when we did Egypt, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, they were still living in a structure that had been set up by Joseph. The Pharaoh denied him nothing and even insisted that the beautiful daughter of the high priest of On, named Essenes, become his bride. I think that's how you pronounce it. According to the Akashic records, she was also the other portion of his own entity, and I believe that she had studied, since her father, On, had this mystery temple, which was carrying on the teachings of Rata from earliest Egypt. She may have acted as a Beatrice or spiritual guide in that lifetime, because he would not have come out in the Hebrew tradition of such a mystical tradition as she did. So she may have brought also a mystical understanding to him. And the love story of Asenath was immortalized by Rembrandt, who, when he died, Rembrandt the painter, suddenly on his deathbed, he told everyone he remembered he'd been Jacob in a past life. But it's interesting that long before Rembrandt died, he felt drawn to paint Asenath, the wife of Joseph, perhaps from soul memory, as she would in that lifetime have been his daughter-in-law. And it's interesting for people who do channel artwork that some of this, what I got out of this, is it can be soul memories of people that you have known or situations you've known in past lives. So anyway, Joseph and Asenath had a happy marriage, and their children were Ephraim and Manasseh. And these two sons represent, out of the 12 tribes of Israel, England and America are represented by those two sons. And finally, and probably the daughters too, I'll have to throw them in. And finally, as the Bible says, during the predicted famine, his brothers had to journey to him, he was now the grand vizier, and they didn't, of course, know who he was, and he was dramatic, so he kind of tricked them and set up that situation where they had to get the food and supplies. They had to bring back his real brother Benjamin. And finally, he said he was going to keep Benjamin, and of course the Bible says that, I guess Judah, one of the brothers, pleaded. He was very upset, the same one that had sold him away, said that he would stay in Benjamin's place because this would just kill his father if Benjamin didn't come back. And that touched Joseph. I guess he could relinquish and forgive somewhat. So he greeted his family, he hugged his brother, cried on his shoulder, and in fact had his family come to live in Goshen, which was about as far away as Los Angeles to here, but he never quite had them live in Memphis, where he was. So there was a deep hurt there in what had happened. And because of that, he had to be the best at everything. He was certainly brilliant, insightful, he had all these past lives under his belt, but he couldn't stand for anyone to outshine him because of the inferiority he had felt earlier in his life. So his weakness again was great personal pride. And I think it's more meaningful to me anyway, to us, if we look at the soul who later became Jesus as somebody who was struggling with personal weaknesses in past lives, and this wasn't just I never for myself could relate so much to the Sunday school concept of this being who was totally removed from me, who came here, suffered for an hour, but I know a lot of people who've suffered even worse that I've read about. I mean, people in concentration camps, abused children, and therefore it was just some extraordinary distant person who changed everything. But when I read in Edgar Cayce, the excellent book called, there was a book you might want to read, I don't know if it's in print, called The Story of Jesus by Jeffrey First, which is an excellent account of Palestine, many excerpts of key readings. And I was fortunate enough to meet Jeffrey First later on before his death. And Jeffrey First, the man who wrote the book, was almost out of context for that kind of book. He was more of a theatrical type, and yet he put together a wonderful collection that really helps quicken a deeper understanding of Palestine. In any case, well, I'm losing this train of thought.
Excuse me, but were the life readings that Edgar Cayce had given that Jeffrey First knew about?
He collected Edgar
Okay,
Cayce's
that's what
readings.
it was.
He really just,
Yeah.
but he put them together in an insightful way chronologically that makes that time come alive. And you read about everybody. I mean, the daughter of the innkeeper and her personal struggles with the whole thing. You really get into all these insights. And man, there were many women, Cayce said, who were close to Jesus that almost like disciples as well. And this comes to life through the readings. In fact, there was a woman teacher named Judith who, at the time of the Essenes, they predicted that Jesus was going to have a very unique teacher. And this one couple got the message that their child yet to be born would be Jesus' teacher. And it was still a time of oppression to women in many ways. And so when their child was a girl, they felt they still had to go along with the prophecy because the time of Atlantis in Egypt had been extinguished and girls weren't being offered these opportunities. And she apparently, Judith, was the one who took him through some of the back into some of his past lives. They journeyed, as when he was in the lost years, to Persia, and they journeyed to India and everything. So that really, if you read the story of Jesus, you get a fuller picture of all the characters that played the parts in that time period, as well as some of the traditional ones. So it was more meaningful to me when I read that book and could see that this was a soul who had, like me, had lived through human emotions and struggled with these things. It felt more reachable and attainable than this otherworldly Sunday school entity that came and was gone again and had little to do with me. So it certainly made sense. So he had to be the best at everything. He became the greatest architect, but here he was now a Hebrew person who had become this Egyptian vizier or ruler, a sub-ruler, like sort of Secretary of State, and he used Hebrew and other people. During the famine, people would give him, and this is all in the regular historical accounts, they would give him everything in exchange, in the Bible too, in exchange for food. And he didn't really enslave them exactly, but there was nothing going on where they lived. They were in a state of famine, and so he would give them food. They would give their holdings, their money, and their cattle and stuff, and he would give them food, and then he would send them to the far outskirts of Egypt. So they were in kind of a quasi-exile, not really. But his purpose in this was to build. He used them it was like kind of the WPA during Roosevelt's time. It was a workforce, and he built roads and temples, and even the step pyramid at Saqqara. And I think it was that pyramid, or one similar that he built, engineered, that had 1 mile, it said, inside of it. It was one structure that had a mile full of temples and corridors. I mean, these are incredibly huge constructs that were built. Maybe that's one that's no longer.
It might be. Go ahead. I'll
So,
see if I can find it.
And he was considered the great wise man. Imhotep in all priestly wisdom. He had a divining cup, and apparently Jessica saw a copy of this when she went to Egypt. She said it was like a very large glass, and inside of it, it was like silvered or mirrored, so that in looking inside of it, it would be like a crystal ball and suggest images. And
Excuse me, Lynn, which lifetime are you talking about?
Joseph.
Oh, Joseph, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Joseph actually had occult abilities as well as all these other abilities, and he's picking up very heavily on the good karma of Hermes, because Hermes the Black Man helped out Rata, advised Isis, but he never really was given tremendous leadership compared to this. So I think Joseph was drawing the good karma of all that Hermes had done, and he was just renowned for his accomplishments, including mathematics, medicine, and architecture. Like the Black Hermes, he was, in this lifetime as Joseph, exiled into a new land. Only in this land he became glorified and reaped the good karma of Hermes. At the end of his life, though, he lived to be 110, as did Joshua. He turned his thoughts again to his own, the Hebrew people, and he wrote the book of Joseph, which I guess is part of the Dead Sea Scroll material. And it was to be for his children, Ephraim and Manasseh, etc., and his grandchildren. And it sounds very much like the words of Jesus. But in it, he goes over and over some of the sufferings caused by his jealous brothers, as if he's not, able to totally release that. And that, I wanted to share with you some writings from that then.
Is this it here?
Yeah, that's it. There you go.
It's
That's one of
quite
the
a tiny-
structures
here,
of King
I'll put it up
Zoser
for the
and
camera.
Joseph.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another parallel between the writings of Joseph in the book of Joseph and the writings of Jesus in Matthew. After you get a chance to see that. Okay, so here from the book of Joseph, and he's really telling, now, one of the benefits for me doing this reading, and it might help you as well, I'm seeing that the Bible, which at times I've either embraced or utterly rejected, depends on what mood I'm in. If I'm in a mood against chauvinism, I think I'm very anti-Bible, and other times I've studied it as literature, and other times I've been very drawn to it. But now I see that it really depends which author you read, who you're reading, because some things, like when we're going to get into Moses was very troubled, very anti-woman and everybody else in many ways. On the other hand, there's some very comforting, some of the works of Joseph or Isaiah or whatever I'm going to look into again. So it gave me the sense that it's not one lump. This is just it's like an anthology, and you get very different viewpoints. Plus, of course, there are many books that were decided almost arbitrarily not to be included in the Bible that may carry more of the essence of the teachings. So anyway, from the book of Joseph, I was beset with hunger. Of course, I was sold into slavery, and the Lord of all made me free. He's thinking of what happened to him. I was beset with hunger, and the Lord himself nourished me. I was taken into captivity, and his strong hand succored me. I was alone, and God comforted me. I was sick, and the Lord visited me. And Jesus said through Matthew 25, for I was hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. Very similar, isn't it? Okay, so we're going to leave now Joseph, and going forward in time, these are over some lives we've already studied. To review, we next would have come Khans, the little Egyptian prince. And his twin soul was the, Syrian princess who never met him but was healed by his statue, like the statue of the Catholic saint, what they call his double. And then we studied the second Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita, and his wife Radha had died early. And then next would have been the son of the sun, little prince Cotton, I never say that right, and his sister Mekatan, who died in her 11th year and then overshadowed him. And then, chronologically, we would come to the lifetime of Joshua and his sister Miriamne. So Joshua, and then we'll touch on Moses too. First, probably we should touch on Moses. We left Moses off. he was dying from the madness of Mitanni as Akhenaten. He had blinded his sister Nefertiti. I mean, he really had a lot of anger going toward his sister, and some of this was because just before that he had been Thutmose III, remember, who was so angry at his stepmother Hatshepsut, who was a strong ruler, and he killed her and went on to conquer all the Jewish people and enslave all of them. And that was because before that, we go back to that unfortunate lifetime where he was Ishmael, sent into the desert by his mother Sarah. A very large mistake, but not enough necessarily to justify what he did later. So touching on Moses had been Thutmose, reacting to his stepmother. We touched on that, and after he killed her, to deny that he killed her, I mean, he had a love-hate relationship, he went out to bind the barbarians, and he just conquered everybody in sight. And then, sick of war, when he died, he came back as Akhenaten, who was somewhat mystical but extremely troubled. He was the result of all that brother-sister intermarriage, and he was deformed somewhat in body, and later on, at about the age of 40, he became rather mad. And so, but indirectly, out of that time period, we talked about how, due to some infighting in the court, malice in the palace with Tai, his mother, and being excluded from the worship of Egypt at the time, she advocated even more strongly that he bring in something new. So they got this concept of the one god Aten. Although the Egyptians had always had a sense of one source, they had many of saint-like figures, but in this time, out of that time, we get the concept of the one god or one source. And so that's what happened to Akhenaten, and he ended up being mad. He blinded his sister Nefertiti, and that was it. And so he came back as Moses, because what had Thutmose done? Thutmose had gone out and enslaved all the Jewish people, and now he comes back in as Moses, who unconsciously remembers enslaving the Semitic people. And he also remembers unconsciously turning the worship of the one God to the worship of the one God, and then when he was most mad, he swung back away from it. But so he had this in his subconscious mind. And he was the son in the Bible of the Hebrew woman Jochebed, that's how you pronounce it, who was fished from the water by the Egyptian princess Bithiah. And he was very loved by two mothers, as well as by his sister Miriam. In fact, he might have been the twin soul to Bithiah. But he was still, for some reason, deeply hostile and unforgiving of women, perhaps because of the distant actions of Sarah in his earlier lifetime as Ishmael, when he was sent into the desert by his mother Hagar. And that's what Jessica attributes it to. But let's also put it in context of a time when there is a lot of hostility toward women, and their earlier running of mystery temples and so forth, that there was sort of a jealousy that you can see also in the stabbing of Nefertiti and Hatshepsut, a swinging now to the patriarchal system and a real extinguishing of that time where it was more matriarchal. So I think Moses was also part of that, a creature of that time and an agent of that oppression, really. So and although the Ten Commandments may have been divinely inspired in many ways, some certain harsh laws enabling men to easily put aside their wives, but the wives couldn't put aside the husband, etc., might have not have just come from his own self. And nor, perhaps, did God direct him to slaughter 3,000 men after he came down from the mountain and found the people worshiping the golden calf. And the golden calf is an old matriarchal image that went back to the time of Isis, who became Sarah, his rotten foster mother who sent him in the desert.
And it's the golden calf.
Oh, great. So there's the golden calf, and not necessarily advocating that they should or shouldn't have been worshiping it. However, killing 3,000 people over it might have been a little extra anger. So, because the golden calf was associated with Isis, and Isis was the same soul who, according to this research, who became Nefertiti, who became Hatshepsut, that he was so angry at from way back when. So it helps us to understand. And along with his brother Aaron, he slaughtered thousands of women in his campaigns. If he discovered that they were not virgins, he said they might seduce his men, and he killed them systematically, and often children too. Edgar Cayce gave a reading for a man who had joined in on that slaughter of the women, and he said that you won't be happy, at least in the lifetime. He said the karma of it, you're not going to be happy in marriage, and that was at least in this lifetime. But I know a fellow who thinks he might have been Aaron, and he has this deep feeling that this inability to marry or be happy in marriage may have been going on for a long, long, long time because of the karma of doing this. What was that?
Oh, it's just some old and nomadic.
So we have the golden calf here.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not wonderful, but it's not worth killing 3,000 over it either, perhaps. So, and she had an interesting insight. Remember how whenever his word was disputed, a cloud by day would appear, cloud over the sun, but she does indicate that the books of the Pentateuch, and I think that must be an ancient Jewish book, did involve a knowledge of magic and the esoteric, and Moses had been Akhenaten, he had been in some key places, and she wonders if he was using some Atlantean consciousness to be able to manifest a cloud by day every time they wouldn't do exactly what he said. And there were a lot of people who, although they were supposedly led out of slavery, but not all of their Egyptian experience was complete slavery, and as the Bible says, many times they said to Moses, better we had remained in Egypt than going with you into the desert. So he made a few mistakes. In this case, the soul may have gained some but lost quite a little bit more. Now Joshua was with him in this, and had also the karma of having to help bring the Jews out of enslavement. And Joshua was the one, Cayce said, was another lifetime of Jesus, who has been, remember, all these other ones that we're studying, Melchizedek and Hermes and Enoch and everything. And when, this comes after Joseph, when Joseph used those who, quote, bonded themselves to him and to his pharaoh Zoser for his great building program, sending them to the outermost borders of Egypt, so Joshua was born to a people who were in bondage. It was his karma to lead them out of Egypt, although his karma was far less severe than that of Moses. Joshua and Moses had been together before as father and son when Joshua was little King Tut and his father was the mad Akhenaten. So Moses was Akhenaten and Joshua had been King Tut. And there's a quote from Jessica's book. I didn't put the page number. Oh, good, I wrote it down. That's clever. And she says, and Joshua, could one possibly say that when Joshua, who was astute as Joseph in many ways, who sent spies into Canaan to find out if it were worth the effort of conquering it, was it possible that Joshua also depended upon a little magic? How did the walls of Jericho fall? What other military leader in all history, and Joshua must be called a military leader at this point, in all history would have advised his soldiers to march around the walls of Jericho day after day, blasting away on the ram's horn, the Hebrew instrument, until the wall fell flat so that people went up into the city? So there may have been some esoteric and mystical knowledge. Remember, the building of the Great Pyramid may have involved balancing of forces in ways that we don't fully understand. So maybe Joshua was invoking Atlantean or mystical knowledge here. He also guarded the Ark of the Covenant, considered by the Hebrews as a sacred instrument of the one God, for 40 years in his journey across the desert in the land of Canaan. In this lifetime, the soul who was later to become Mary was named Miriamne, the much younger sister of Joshua. And sometimes our names have a similarity from life to life. And she was known as a prophetess and a sweet singer of songs, even in a time when women weren't. Who knows what she really all fully did, but that's all we get out of the Bible, that she was known as a prophetess and a sweet singer of songs. And I'm thinking that she may have picked up on the lifetime as Joseph's wife Asenath, whose father was a priest, and coming in and being a prophetess now as Miriamne. But Edgar Cayce still described Joshua as a man, even though his sister was there with him, as lonely in spirit. He also had lost a sweetheart he wanted to marry to tuberculosis. So the next key lifetime we want to consider, while taking a deep breath and waking up from a long saga through the Old Testament, it was for me too, we only have 3 more to go, is that of Asaph with his twin soul Sarah or Serapha. And Asaph was, when Jesus lived in, we'll get into this later, but when Jesus lived in Palestine, they did believe in reincarnation, and I'll explain to you how that's suggested later. And they kept saying, were you the son of David? And he said, I'm not the son of David. Well, in Palestine, when you said, are you the son of, it meant, are you the past life of? That. And he said he wasn't David. Who he really was Asaph, who was a musician scribe in the court of David. And he was very secure in his friendship with David. And as Joseph had found favor with the pharaoh Zoser, just the same pattern, Asaph found favor with King David. He came from the house of Levi. He was a Levite unknown. And at the time that David wanted the Ark of the Covenant removed from the house of Obed-Edom, an unknown, but this Asaph just emerged as an unknown, dedicated young musician, and he was chosen to sound the cymbals before the Ark during its removal to the city of David. See, nothing is by chance. Nothing is really by chance. He had been Joshua, who had taken care of, watched over the ark, babysat the ark, and for 40 years in the desert, and now suddenly he's the one being chosen to sound the cymbals. Kind of, he emerges out of the blue. And just as Joshua had known a happy relationship with his Joseph, with Asenath, the Egyptian princess, so Asaph had a happy marriage with his twin soul Sarah, or Serapha, mother of 9 sons, and probably some daughters too, who later formed a choir with their father as the choir master. She was a musician, she was excellent at the lyre and the harp, and she was the first woman musician in the school of the Essenes. After Asaph's death, she lived in the community with her sons. Asaph was aware of his past lifetimes and was caught up in the poetry of the soul, the meaning of the mysteries, and our relationship to the eternal. He's credited with writing some of the Psalms, including Psalms 45, 50, and 73, which deal, and this is absolutely true as I read this, with personal remembrance of past lives, and I want to show you why I think that's true. Now here is Asaph, who's already lived a past life as Joseph and then Joshua, and he's writing a psalm, and he writes, "A psalm we read almost as if he were writing of himself as Joseph, son of Jacob and Rachel, father of Ephraim and Manasseh, and brother of Benjamin." And this is his psalm that this guy much later, centuries later, writes. "Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, thou who leadest Joseph like a flock. Thou who art enthroned upon the cherubim, shine forth before Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh." Now why would he write about this? Just about all the characters in history. In the same psalm, as if remembering the next life he had as Joshua, he said, "Thou didst bring a vine out of Egypt, thou didst drive the nations and plant it." And there are lots more, a lot of more evidence of that if you read through some of those psalms. So there's one other I thought I'd share with you. Find it. Oh, so many healings have been associated with those psalms. Apparently, here even in the 20th century, there's a man named Clifford Beers. If you've heard of him, the author of *The Mind That Found Itself*. He was extremely mentally ill. He had a long breakdown, and he's known to be someone who later recovered from this and helped many people who were mentally ill. And when he was in one of this interminable breakdown and suffering all these terrors, he heard the words from the 45th Psalm of Asaph, and he was totally healed. And Jessica herself tells her own story. During the Depression, she was a child who was adopted at 2 weeks of age, and later she looked up her adopted brothers. One was adopted into a Jewish family and one into a Christian family, and they both, ironically, she never felt to introduce herself to her adopted brothers, because when she went to see one of them, he was a Jewish doctor, and she came in his office and he was on the phone to his mother, and he didn't know, obviously, that his mother was not his mother, and he had all the inflections of that culture, and he was so close to his mother, she just couldn't bring herself to say, "I'm your long-lost sister." So in any case, but over many years later, both of her brothers independently, when her book on twin souls was circulated through Fate magazine, they both wrote and asked for it, and she knew they were her brothers and they never knew. So isn't that an interesting coincidence? But she, because of a karma she feels of suicide in a past life, she was orphaned at 2 weeks of age, and this was in the South, and a well-to-do man came wandering through the orphanage and just fell in love with her and adopted her. His wife didn't even know they were going to adopt a child and promptly left him for a whole year. And the wife was very hard on her for a long time at the beginning of her childhood, I think, which was karma from a past life. So in any case, in the Depression, her beloved foster father had died because of he lost everything in the crash, and he killed himself. So it was, at 16, she lost the person who was most loving to her. And she went to stay with some fundamentalist type people. Because she had very nice clothes, they didn't think that she was as poor as she was, but she was living for every 2 weeks for her check from, I don't know where she was typing for being a secretary at some other church. I think she was a secretary at every religion there was, learning all these things. But And she weighed 92 pounds, she said, and while waiting for her next paycheck, she lost, I guess, down to almost like 72 pounds, and she was starving to death. And she, and she was engaged to be married to a fellow named David, ironically, from UCLA or something, and he was supposed to come visit her or meet her, maybe bring her money for food or whatever, and he was killed on the way. And she learned that her mother had just gone into a coma, and so her whole life was at a low ebb, and she went into a room and turned on the gas, intending to fully kill herself. And she was helped somewhat by a healing experience that related to one of the Songs of Asaph. Let's see if I can touch on that. She said she was earning 30 cents an hour at that time. And she says it is said that events, whether they are positive or negative, tend to come in cycles, and all these happen. Again, she had no thought of what would happen if she committed suicide. She could not bear the aloneness. There was nothing else to do, she believed. And so she opened the transom, closed the windows and pushed the transom up and turned on the gas at this place where she worked. An hour went past. She was not even sleepy. Another hour. How long did it take to die? Dr. Jameson had left at 3 in the afternoon. It was now at 5, and nothing had happened. She put her head down on the small table in the room. She was incapable of thinking how much it would hurt Dr. Jameson and others for her to have chosen the old Sunday school room in which to take her life. She knew only her own suffering, nothing more. Why? This was the only word she could remember. It was dark now, and the fumes of the gas were very strong. She coughed a little. Perhaps it would happen soon. From somewhere in the church she heard music. People were singing. This was Tuesday. Choir practice was on Friday, but the music continued. They were male voices, and they were growing louder. Then they were about her in this room, but the words were strange, as if they were in a forgotten language. She moved to turn on the light, but something held her back. She knew the words of the hymn. Someplace she had read it, and in English she heard a voice speaking. The music continued as a background, and as she listened to the words, she knew that this was a psalm. It was Psalm 45, her favorite. The words were now very clear, and they too were coming from inside her rather than outside. Only the music and singing seemed captured in the very walls of the room. The words, how beautiful they were, how beautiful. Hearken, O daughter, and consider, this is the Psalm of Asaph, and incline thine ear. Forget also thine own people and thy father's house. So shall the king greatly desire thy beauty, for he is the Lord, and worship thou him. And the daughter of Tyre shall be there with a gift, even the rich among the people shall entreat thy favor. The king's daughter is all glorious within, her clothing is of wrought gold. She shall be brought unto the king in raiment of needlework. The virgins, her companions, shall be brought unto thee. With gladness and rejoicing shall they be brought. They shall enter into the king's palace. Instead of thy fathers shall be thy children, whom thou mayest make princes in all the earth. And I will make thy name be remembered in all generations. Therefore shall the people praise thee forever and ever. 3 times she heard these words with the background music like some ancient chant. Then there was nothing but the darkness. She turned on the light, turned off the gas, threw open the window, and so forth. And she said, and then she realized she never had closed the transom anyway. There was just enough air coming into the room that kept her alive. And she looked it up, and it was to the Psalm of Asaph, a wedding song, a song of loves, and so forth. And and so she felt that once she might have been with David long ago, and in a strange series of events that followed this experience. Of course, she lived, and many years later, she was associated with many people in Hollywood, sort of on the periphery of that scene, and many people came to her who were interested in dreams and these kinds of teachings. And I won't share the rest of the long story, but finally, she was meeting with a man. She was decorating a house in such a way that connected with a past life that Cayce had read for. In any case, he said, just a moment, I may as well get the story correct if I'm going to bother to say it. So. Well, she had dreamed, that's right, the night before her fiancé died, she had this dream that she was married to him in a past life, and that it was in Siam, and that she'd been with him long ago, and that they'd lived a very, very happy lifetime. And she says, was it by chance that the night before David was killed that she should have seen this motion picture projected, in a sense, as a dream or almost a vision? And years later, she attended a lecture with a prominent motion picture director, Michael Korda, and she felt as if she'd known him from long ago. And at the same time, she'd finally married in her life, and I guess it was kind of a marriage of friendship more, but it was helpful to her. And they were getting a house in the Hollywood Hills, which she had an impulse to decorate with all kinds of gold and much gold and ivory, almost as if it were in the time of Siam, like the dream that she'd had, where she was married to this fellow who had been killed. And this motion picture director had gone to Edgar Cayce during his lifetime and had gotten a reading, and he said in the reading that he had decorated such a palace for a little Siamese queen, and it was decorated exactly, he said, in the way that she was choosing to decorate her house. I know that's complicated, but the bottom line is that Edgar Cayce had added a sentence for the little queen who would hear of this reading 30 years hence. He had said, and when he gave the reading was the same time that she was very poor and attempting suicide, and he had said, "Today she is in a very menial position, but she is searching out these truths with her whole heart." So that was a complex story, but anyway, the Psalms of Asaph were helpful and healing to her and to others. So, we only have two more. And next in our chronology, we've already talked about, if we go through chronologically, next would come Zoroastrianism. Zend, the father of Zoroaster. Zend was a past life of Jesus. Zoroaster, a past life of John the Beloved, with his wife that he was very close to, Zara. And Our Lady of Guadalupe, apparently, Jessica felt, is similar in appearance to the way the soul who became Mary might have looked in Persia, with her stars on her robe and in her complexion and so forth. And so finally, next we come in time to another Old Testament life of Jeshua and his mother Maria. Maria? Is that how it's pronounced? Maria. He was a Persian Hebrew scribe who rewrote the books of the Old Testament, which had been begun by Melchizedek. His mother, and who was obviously his twin soul too, Maria, had been abandoned, I guess left without a husband, and that time that was really bad to be abandoned. I mean, it wasn't like today, the swinging single mother. It was really a bad thing. And he suffered with her and used her as a prototype for his own captive peoples in the writing of Deutero-Isaiah. Jessica says that the mission of Jeshua, who was also Deutero-Isaiah, would seem to have been threefold. As a comforter of the people who were once again seeking their homeland, he became a comforter of all mankind. As a prophet, he knew no equal in his time. And once again, assuming the role that he had like Joshua, he acted as an intercessor for the Jews with Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was a Persian king who lived in Joshua's time, and he had to go to this king and ask for the release of the Jews from Babylon. But Cyrus was he was a fierce king, but he was also very into the religion of Zoroaster. And since Jeshua had been Zend, the father of Zoroaster, a cord was rung there, and quite peaceably he was able to appeal to Cyrus for that release. The book of Isaiah is really an anthology of poems composed by more than one author, and this author that was Jesus is probably the second Isaiah. Chapters 56 to 66 are credited to him. And Edgar Cayce did indicate in his readings that this is one of his past lives. Isaiah, if you read the Old Testament of Isaiah, Babylon, very good, getting out of Babylon. If you read the Old Testament of Isaiah, there are passages again that seem to connect to the lifetime of Jesus. So let's look at this book, page 7. And it's think of all the parallels. And all these parallels, 7 isn't here, but in any case, 7. So Deutero-Isaiah had passages which truly had a prophetic quality. It is almost as if he is foretelling of the Christ to come. He says, this is writing long before the time of Jesus, "He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their face. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. Was Jeshua not prophesying the Christ which he was to become as Jesus? But was he not also writing of his own sorrows in the earth, the stranger within the land, the citizen of the universe?" So he had a difficult life. He was suffering the karma because when he had been Rama, the proud Atlantean, and he thought his wife Sita was having a child by somebody else, he put her aside completely. And so now he has a mother that he loves a lot who's been put aside by her husband. And he's sort of close to her throughout the life and suffering that feeling of alienation. So he was a leader from captivity like Joshua, an intercessor like Joseph. And he also writes of his own past lives, in a sense.
Now, who is that right there? And the other page?
Lynn tuned into them, and she thought that they were channel drawings that I found, that they were Rama and Sita.
Oh, that would be Sita.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you showed
Yeah, and the
me.
other one being Rama, like the Atlantean, who came, he was the proud Atlantean, he came into the magical time of early India, and they brought in the teachings of, embedded in the Indian culture and the Vedas, some of the teachings of all the time in Atlantis, the realm of magic and stuff, and that would really be very much, to me, like the energy of Sita, maybe with a little darker complexion or something. Okay, so how did Deutero-Isaiah write about his own past lives and karma? Remember, he had been Joseph. And here, listen, remember when Joseph had the dream that everybody bowed down to him? Well, this is Isaiah says, the sons also of them that afflicted thee shall come bending unto thee, and all they that despise thee shall bow themselves down at the soles of thy feet. And he writes, so he's really tuning back, again, to his own past lives, as we all do. And the moral of this is that all inside of you are all your subconscious memories of the past. Maybe this wasn't your soul path. Maybe you were an actor or something else, but it's all hidden inside you, and you're going to be drawn to the same state. It's the same expression as before to build on it. Okay, so he knew great aloneness and the love of his sorrowing mother, and it was interesting. He compared God's love to God itself to a mother's love, and he said in the Bible, "As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you." He identified with all who are lonely in spirit. And I thought Jessica had very interesting insight here. She said, no person really ever takes the mantle of the prophet, the robe of the mystic, the path of the initiate, who has not known great personal suffering. And if you think about your own life, and those who are really on that path, they have suffered. And he died finally, he was sawed in half, they think, which is a lot of suffering. And so finally, we are coming into the home stretch here, the last lifetime, and that's Palestine, and now we're ready to look at Jesus and Mary finally. And so much has been said about them. I mean, we all pretty much know the story. But from the esoteric viewpoint, Edgar Cayce said that Jesus' advent was prepared for years by the Essenes, that long-established mystery school. Not only the Essenes, but the Pharisees, too, believed in reincarnation. And the word resurrection was a very common word that meant to them at that time reincarnation. When Jesus said Elias has come already, meaning that John the Baptist was Elias or Elijah the prophet, he was referring to reincarnation. And here he's it says, at the time of Jesus, not only the Essenes, but those of the long-established mystery school, the Pharisees accepted reincarnation as a fact. And Jesus spoke of reincarnation quite simply when he said, Elias has come already, meaning that John the Baptist was Elias or Elijah the prophet. And he found an interesting parallel, incidentally, in the readings on John the Baptist. Cayce gave a reading to a woman who was said to have been the wife of Herod, and that she'd also been Jezebel in a past life. And when the prophet Elijah had Jezebel thrown to the dogs because he believed that she and her followers worshipped false gods or goddesses, in dying she cursed him. She was very angry, and she said at some place, sometime, she would retaliate. And so she came back as Salome, with the wife of Herod. And when Herod said, is there anything you want, Salome? She said, the one thing I want is the head of John the Baptist. So she retaliated against whatever had been done to her. Okay, great. So there, from what I understand, in reading that reincarnation was an everyday thing. The multitudes understood when you said, are you the son of so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so, it was a kind of an in-crowd way of saying, is that your past life?
You mean everyone in Palestine, or just the Essenes, or what?
Well, apparently the Essenes did, and many in the multitude did. Maybe it was
Oh.
something that had been believed in, and the common people, the poorer people still kept it in their tradition,
Mm.
kind of a thing.
When you
But there were
think
some
about
groups that
India
did not.
Today, contemporary India, they still have, many of their young people still have soul memory of who they were the
Mhm.
last lifetime. I mean,
It's kind of
been
like
written
that,
up
maybe.
quite a
Maybe,
bit.
and then some of the other sects coming in were throwing it out, the higher ups, but it was still among the people and among the Essenes and Pharisees. So, and there was another Jewish text that still exists that gave all the past lives of key figures in the Bible, including Ruth. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, says, in the history of the Jewish people, Josephus speaks of reincarnation even in the history of his people. And he said their doctrine, of the Essenes he writes, their doctrine is this: the bodies are corruptible, but souls are immortal and continue forever. The Pharisees believe that souls have immortal vigor in them, that they'll have power to revive and live again. He explains carefully that only the Sadducees believe that bodies are corruptible and that souls died with bodies. And unfortunately, apparently the tradition that went on was the Sadducee tradition, and the Essenian tradition we're trying to bring back in our mystical, metaphysical churches and so forth. And so this was, there were those groups that really did believe in past lives at that time. And surely, since Jesus by this time was a very old soul, meaning many incarnations and soul growth, and Cayce says the old soul will know intuitively that he or she has lived before. So, finally, who was Jesus? Subconsciously, perhaps even consciously, he was the sum of all these lives that we've been studying. He was everything that he'd experienced. And who was Mary? She was the same. She was an Essene initiate. I really think the story of Mary is not as fully to light as the story of Jesus, and I invite all of you to research it more fully. As we come into this age of Mary, I think we're going to understand in a way that we only have small glimpses of her in the Old Testament period. I think there's a mystery associated with Mary that we do not fully know. Put that out. But in any case, from what we know,
There's a wonderful book, I wish I could remember the title, but it has to do with Mary's birth and the secret teaching schools that she went to prior, knowing that she was to give birth to Jesus in her very young years. It's quite a lovely, beautiful book.
I'd like to read it very much.
Marilyn Palmer Hall makes a comment of it in 12 World Teachings.
What does he say?
This is
He makes
actual
a
book,
comment,
and it has all the dialogue and everything. It's wonderful.
What does he say about her?
He makes a commentary on some of the preparations
Of Mary?
yeah.
And then that's what your book is also saying, Alexi. So, well, I would love to read these, because I really feel there's some more that I don't know about this. I sense that in writing this is quite inadequate on her, that there's a lot more.
Cayce in the early church also has that dialogue about her preparation.
Yeah, and some of that part I'm familiar with, where, but it sounds like she was prepared in more ways than
Oh,
just for
yes.
the birth of Jesus. She was an initiate in her own right, and there is the. Okay, yeah, I know a little bit about how she was an Essene initiate, one of 11 maidens, and she waited in one of those morning rituals again with the sun coming up. When she was standing on the stairs, there was an angel who finally appeared and chose the one that would be, have this immaculately conceived child. But Cayce did verify that she also was immaculately conceived by her mother Anne, and that he said that Mary and Jesus he implies almost closer in that lifetime than twin souls. They were almost like one person. Now, we certainly get a very separated view from the way the Bible is written, somewhat chauvinistically, but he said they were really very linked in energy, and that she would have been there, neither of them could have been in the body at that time without the other, something like that, and that it was almost like what happened there is like a reversal of the way the soul split in some way. The soul split apart. In this case, one soul, maybe they blended in one, and one came out of the other in a sense. I mean, it was sort of a re-splitting, and I think that the different twin soul couples may have split in different ways because, for example, Edgar Cayce in his twin soul, from one of his readings, may have lived in a female body as one person well long into Atlantis. And I'm guessing from the Adam and Eve thing, as somewhat distorted as we have it, it may be saying that in that case maybe they had lived in a male appearing body together and then split. I don't know. So in this case, it's sort of a reversal of this. So she was an Essene initiate, she was one of the 11 maidens, and, they were, and Cayce implies they were closer almost than twin souls, they were almost as one soul in that lifetime. It's interesting that Jesus' actual Hebrew name was Jeshua in the lifetime of Jesus, not Jesus, just like his last lifetime previous to this. But the Greeks were those who called him Jesus or Jesus later, and it was not, you can verify that, he was not really called Jesus, it was really Jeshua. So who was Jesus? And
Could I just say one thing
Sure,
about
please.
Mary? Among some of the Christian churches, the Trinitarian
Mhm.
doctrine of the three persons
Mhm.
and the deity and so
Mhm.
forth, is very strong patriarchal,
Mhm.
if you know, concept. Carl Jung in 1950, when the dogma of the Assumption, the taking of Mary's body, the assuming of Mary's body
Mhm.
into
Mhm.
heaven, whatever that means, he said that decree that
Mhm.
now it was to be believed as dogma by this great number of people on the earth. He said it was the single most important dogma that could have happened in the moving of the human psyche to the unity toward restoring the femininity to the deity.
Oh. And was her body thought to have been
Mhm.
taken then from the earth, just like Jesus's?
Yeah, there was thought to be some kind of a passage of seemingly death. In the Orthodox tradition, in the Russian Orthodox tradition, they call it the dormition. It means the falling of sleep. And then the soul was free then to leave, but not leave the body, just
Body and everything became more
move to
ethereal.
the other dimension.
Like Melchizedek, like
Right.
Jesus'
And when
body.
you're talking about the twin,
Interesting.
that closer
Mhm.
than twin,
Mm-hmm.
that idea of the resurrected Christ and the ascension, as it's called,
Mary.
of the ascension of Christ into heaven, body and soul.
Mm-hmm.
That was just all that was connecting in my mind.
Yeah.
But I remember that, and everything that is happening in the more Orthodox tradition
Mm-hmm.
is having to deal with how does one integrate the feminine in this long 2,000-year special, well, more than that.
I mean, things that are happening now, crises
Right.
now. Oh, yeah, the priesthood and the
implication of that
everything.
is,
Yeah.
and you can look at it in that light of what did that do in
Excellent.
placing that person in the deity.
Excellent. And there are some hints in Catholicism, from what I understand. Sometimes Mary is sort of linked to the Holy Spirit
Right.
at times, but I firmly believe that we cannot come into our next step in consciousness until we don't no longer even make the feminine as just a helper or a mother, but comes back into its power and balance. And many people are very concerned with what they call the male and female energy in themselves, although I think we have to be cautious not to see it in stereotypical terms. I think Jung had many good things, but he was viewing from his culture, and so what he would say is your feminine energy was what the culture then said it was. And we don't really know. In an ancient matriarchal society, there were times when the males was naturally associated with Father Nature, protector of the weak and the moon. And so we can't absolutely say we know about either sex. We don't really know what our gender energy is until we come out of this cycle in which it's been unbalanced. And I really think we need to find freedom to explore that. What were you going to say?
The church also had a problem in that they were saying that Jesus was God, and how could they explain that God was born of a mortal? And so they had to glorify Mary. That's
Mhm.
another tune that was played.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of sides to that facet.
Yeah, there are those who then criticize, but I sort of resonate to the Cayce teaching that they might have been twin soul energies anyway. We've sort of, dare I say it, when it's not glorified Jesus, we made Jesus God, so then what do we do with Mary? We have to
Exactly.
glorify her too. What if they were very special leader soul people who, they are the son and daughter of God, but so is everyone here, who became enlightened through their quests. That might be a way I might look at it, but no one can legislate how you can see it. We're all searching for this understanding in our own way. So Cayce said again, who was Jesus? We're asking, he said, Jesus is the man, the activity, the mind, the relationships he bore to others. Yea, he was mindful of friends. He was sociable, he was loving, he was kind, he was gentle, he grew faint, he grew weak, and yet gain that strength which he has promised in becoming the Christ by fulfilling and overcoming the world. You are made strong in body, in mind and soul, and purpose by that power in Christ. The power then is the Christ. The pattern is in Jesus. And that resonates for me really well. There are other times he lapses into the Presbyterian mode, but most of it, the deeper readings say this. And I certainly, maybe it's my ego, I don't know, but I can identify with this more for myself. And I think it was when he was up on the mountain, tempted by the shaitan, and I'm using the Zoroastrian word, that meant the shadow side of yourself, what Jung said was the shadow. And what Cayce said in the deeper readings that the Ari doesn't want to publish, that Jesus was a real fallen angel in the beginning, that the concept of Lucifer, separate that from Satan, which maybe, the Orthodox concept, Luz meant light, the most light one, that he and they may have been those light beings, super rebellious, like the bright, kids were going to go shake it up, and they came down in the earth realm, and he may have had as great a shadow as light at one time. He may have been the most mad, the most self-interested in the early times, and had to become the most self-sacrificing, and of course, as did Mary. So when he was tempted on the mountain by Shaitan, which is a Zoroastrian term for the shadow in yourself. It was at that time that he attained for all time the Christhood. His temptations were threefold. One was hunger, the temptation of changing rocks to food. He could easily, even as a child, he had some of these magical abilities. And as Hermes, the black Hermes, who nobody fully accepted, maybe it was race, maybe he was a stranger, whatever, he was quite a big man, and he found that food was a nice substitute for love, and have we not all been tempted at times in that way? And that was one of the temptations. So he turned aside from his past life weakness in that. His next temptation was that he could be Shaitan said, his shadow said, you can be born by angels come down from the rooftop or whatever in a magical way, so everybody would know that you're king. And here he was confronting the pride of the mystical Rama, who came from Atlantis in the flying chariot to conquer. Because nobody could really understand Jesus in the same way some of us don't really ever feel understood, because only a mystic understands a mystic, and sometimes one's friends or associates at different stages in the path don't understand one, and so then one feels insecure, and so that's what he was tempted with, that he could have this miracle and they would all know who he was. So he overcame the temptation of Rama, and then third, he could become the greatest of all rulers, which is what Judas hoped would happen when he tried to sell him out, that he would stand up and become against that and become a great physical ruler. And Joseph, for all his glory and all his good karma and everything, he compensated for his insecurities with his brothers and his pride by becoming the greatest ruler in a physical sense, but not necessarily conquering himself. And Mary, too, Jessica suggests, met her own temptations, and I think there's more to her story than we know. In the food, because it's Maria, the wife who was abandoned, she had turned to food in place of love. She may have had a tendency to over-dramatic suffering, which beneath the pain was a certain type of enjoyment. When she was Sita and put aside and jumped in the fire, when she could have gotten back together with her husband, he'd put her aside for so long she enjoyed jumping in the fire and cremating herself, so she had to probably overcome that somehow in the married life. And pride. Now, I have added this. I think that in the Atlantean culture where women were of equal status, as Jessica says, and sometimes even assumed a dominant role, may have misused this, you can imagine her being Mary at a time when women were just vessels. And here she was, in Mary Daly's work, they say that the ancient image of the goddess of old that Robert Graves talks about is totally stripped down in how we think of Mary. I mean, she is just, her eye is on the sun, her son. She has no autonomous life force. And if she had been extremely a leader in Atlantis, and Jessica thought once, she said, maybe could she have attained even to Christhood in Atlantis, and we don't know that. Invite your intuitions on this. Then it must imagine to her pride in going through all these Hebrew lifetimes and being so subordinate. And in addition, so I wonder how she felt with that. Jessica adds that she could have been quite a celebrity later on after Jesus' death, but she didn't choose to do that. One aside thing that's occurred to me, it's interesting in terms of what you said, Mary, when we're looking for that balance of what we stereotypically call male and female. I'm not sure it really has, it is. It's just what we allow male and female people to do. that Jesus, before he could really journey home, he had to do stereotypically female role things like be gentle, be loving, be kind. He had to do that, and he couldn't graduate without doing it. And I just wonder for myself, say, are people who've been in the reverse role, are some of the Eves of the world going to have to come back into their own assertion and outspokenness, etc., as part of their journey back? It's an interesting thought. So we're getting very near the end here. Hang in for a couple more paragraphs. So if we parallel the teachings of Jesus to those of his former lifetimes that we've studied, we've done some of that. I just want to do a little bit more. Maybe we can see the words of the Christ Spirit that Jesus had turned to and shared in different past lives. He said, "In my Father's house there are many mansions," which is another way of saying in that time, past life, past lives. If it were not so, I would not have told you. And in this, okay, the foreword of this book, this manuscript, it says, here are some excerpts from some of just the teachings of the soul who later became Jesus over the ages. The first Christian said, "If we have sinned against the man who loves us, have ever wronged a brother, a friend, or comrade, the neighbor ever with us, or a stranger, remove us from this trespass. Cast all these sins away like loosened fetters, and let us be thine own beloved. Forgive us our trespasses." Hermes said, let's see, "For this cause I believe and I bear witness. I go to life and light. Blessed art thou, O Creator. Thy man would be holy as thou art holy, even as thou gavest him thy full authority." From the book of Eve. Now I don't know where that is. That might be in gathering me thou gatherest thyself. That would be interesting to uncover. Jeshua, called Deutero Isaiah, said, "If thou draw out the soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday, and the Lord shall guide thee continually and satisfy thy soul." And so forth. So there are parallels. We've read many of them. Those are a few more. Just a sense of parallel energy throughout all these teachings. And it's said that if you knew, this was from Jessica Cayce, I don't know if it's true, if those who have known Jesus in any incarnation, or probably more so, sought out that Christ principle with him and with those teachers, may have very expressive eyes, very soft and expressive eyes, as well as compassionate spirit. So it was a long road from creation to the cross, from the selfish madness of a fallen angel in Lemuria, when Jesus, Mary, perhaps, and also perhaps Nefertiti, Abraham, Moses, fell into the earth realm, and when they became stuck and they couldn't go back any longer, that soul who later became Jesus, Mary, called out, "Father, Creator, why have I forsaken you?" And Jesus then, when he was hanging on the cross and said, "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" he was finishing the karma where he turned aside from that creative force in the very beginning of time. And why was it that he had to be a way shower? Was that because he had led the way into the descent and the hell of our own selfishness? Possibly. He was overcoming self, the extreme selfishness of the beginning, and in doing so, he had overcome the necessity of death itself, just as we all must overcome, here a little, there a little, through the Christ spirit of compassion, attunement, long-suffering, and truth, until we too can make our journey home. I wanted to conclude with one last reading, and we're done. This is an Edgar Cayce reading on the Last Supper. His psychic insight, if you will, to that time and that place. And he said, she writes, "Once, following a reading given to a woman of Jewish background, Edgar Cayce was very quiet for a moment. Then he gave a reading on Jesus and the disciples, which is one of the most beautiful readings which has ever been given by him. It paints a word picture of the disciples and of him. And it starts, the Lord's Supper. Here with the Master, we see what they had for supper. Boiled fish, rice with leeks, wine and loaf. One of the pitchers in which it was served was broken. The handle was broken, as was the lip to same. The better looking of the 12, of course, was Judas, while the younger was John, oval face, dark hair, smooth face. He was the only one with the short hair. Peter, the rough and ready, always that of just the opposite from John, very sparse, but inclined to be long more at the side and under the chin, long on the upper lip. His robe was always near gray or black, while his clouts or breeches were striped, while those of Philip and Bartholomew were red and brown. The master's hair is most red, inclined to be curly in portions, not weak, strong, with heavy piercing eyes that are blue or steel gray. His weight would be at least 170 pounds, long tapering fingers, nails well kept, long nail though on the left little finger. Merry, even in the hour of trial. Joke, even in the moment of betrayal. The sack is empty, Judas departs. The last is given of the wine and loaf, with which he gives the emblems that should be so dear to every follower of him. Lays aside his robe, which is all in one piece, girds the towel about his waist, which is dressed with linen that is blue and white, rolls back the folds, kneels first before John, James, and Peter, who refuses. Then the dissertation as to he that would be the greatest would be the servant of all. The basin is taken as without handle and is made of wood. The water is from the gherkins that are in the wide-mouthed shibboleths that stand in the house of John's father Zebedee. And now comes, it is finished. They sang the 91st Psalm, He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, in Him I will trust. He is a musician as well, for he uses the harp. They leave for the garden. And that's it.
We're going to take a short break. There's coffee, tea, and goodies. And each of you that has dreams or experienced memories, bring them back. Because we get to journey there tonight.
Did anyone want to share any commentary at all before we depart from this long?
You can share as you stretch if you choose.
Or you can stay if you like and just talk informally as we take our break or whatever. If anyone has anything they'd like to share.
I was opposite of the floor. I didn't know if you have it.
I do. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry.